at Seerist. We're so excited to have you here. I know this is a really hot topic, and we're really excited to talk about generative AI and security and risk intelligence and what are the pros and the cons and the impact that's going to have. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our two expert speakers. I have Allison Wood, Head of Intelligence at Seerist. She's in Houston. And Matt McKnight, Chief Technology Officer at Seerist. He's in Virginia. So without, like I said, further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Matt, and he's going to take us through a little bit of an overview of what generative AI is and what some of the impacts could be.
Thanks, Lisa. So just to level set for everyone, I wanted to go over real quickly what we mean by generative AI and sort of how that concept builds up. Starting with what is AI. AI is artificial intelligence. Saying artificial intelligence implies that there is something called intelligence. We don't have quite enough time here to define what intelligence is, but artificial intelligence is essentially using a machine to do that thing that we generally call intelligent and associate with what humans are able to do. And then what is machine learning? Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. And with artificial intelligence, you could be doing something which is merely a set of rules that describe how to solve a particular problem. But machine learning is implying that there is something called training data, which is used in order to train the model, so that the model is not explicitly programmed for how to solve a particular problem, but is given a set of examples which are enough information for it to figure out how to solve that problem. And then we have to talk a little bit about what supervised versus unsupervised learning is, which are essentially two of the main subtypes of machine learning. Supervised learning is the kind of learning which requires one to have a correct answer associated with the data. So for example, if I have a picture of a dog and it has a label associated with it that tells us that that's a dog, and that's how I'm trying to learn what pictures of dogs look like, that's supervised learning. Whereas unsupervised learning is a kind of learning where we do not necessarily have a correct answer included in the training set. And so we're just sending you a bunch of pictures of dogs and cats and hoping that you're going to be able to group the similar items together, for example, so that the pictures of dogs get grouped together with the pictures of cats, but without really telling you what the right answer would be ahead of time. Deep learning is a type of technique that's somewhat orthogonal to both of those, but means that you're using a particular architecture of model which involves multiple layers of weights and biases that are summed up to create a output at the end. And that type of learning is often referred to as neural networks because it has an analogous function to the way that neurons in the brain work. And then finally, how do we get to generative models? So when I mentioned before a model that was trying to tell whether a picture is a picture of a dog or not, or so for example, if we had pictures of dogs and cats coming into our system and we wanted to discriminate between those to tell which are the dogs and which are the cats, that would be a discriminative model, whereas a generative model would take in, let's say, many pictures of dogs and attempt to generate a new picture of a dog. So that's kind of the overview of where generative models fit into the landscape of things that we're already dealing with. And essentially what they do is, given a training set of information, they try and generate more things which resemble that training set in some way. So what can these models generate? I was talking before about potentially generating images, but of course they can generate many other modalities of data. A series of images becomes a video. If we attach sound as the potential output there, we can make audio, speech, for example, speech or music. And then text is one of the ones that we hear a lot about today with some of the large language models, which people are perhaps familiar with, such as Bard from Google or ChatGPT from OpenAI, which are models that produce text output. And within text, there's a lot of varieties of what can be produced. So you could be producing summaries of articles. You could be producing obviously chat responses in a conversation, but you could also be producing things like computer code so that a model would be able to output a computer programming language, which could then be used to do additional tasks. And that's where we get into things like actions, so that if we have a limited vocabulary of different types of things that we could do, you could have a generative model that generates a series of actions, which could then be used by some thing to perform tasks or activities in the real world. And essentially we can train these models to output any other kind of structured data, which gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of what they are able to do. So what are the limitations of these things? So if we think about, let's say, for example, the large language models that may have been trained on a massive amount of information that was publicly available on the internet, their training had to be cut off at a particular amount of time. So if these models cost $50 million to train, then you're not going to be running that every single day. And thus the actual training set inside the model becomes useless if you're trying to use it in a security and risk context, look at current events, or if you're trying to look at it at something other than public data, which is not included in its training set. And then when these models generate responses, those responses aren't necessarily able to be traced back to a particular source. So they may contain false information, they may create new information, and if you ask it to provide a source, it may even create another source which doesn't exactly exist in the real world, and that's a phenomenon that's often referred to as hallucination. Many of these models, in terms of how they've been released to the public, have been released in the form of chat models, so that you give it a prompt, it gives you a response, you give it another prompt, it gives you a response. But that's not the right interaction for many domains, in particular where we want to set things off and have them perform a number of actions in an automated fashion for us, or simply take some data that's out there without actually the prompt input in the first place. And then using some of these hosted models that are out there on the internet may actually unintentionally share information with the operator of that model that you don't want to share. So I think that a lot of companies have found out that their employees are using these kinds of models and putting up proprietary company information into them, and then that information gets stored and may even be used to help train the next version of that model and be incorporated into its output, depending on what the licensing terms of the service is that you're interacting with. And then finally, as I mentioned before, with the difficulty in hallucination, the actual output can be difficult to control. So you often have to spend a lot of time trying to convince the algorithm to, via modifying your prompts, to tell you something that you wanted to figure out for you. So it can become quite cumbersome to be able to get it to produce exactly the output that you want. And what are the mitigations for these? So some of the things that we've been looking at doing and have been experimenting with successfully are training or fine-tuning a smaller model on private data. So when we have excellent data that's been created by our analyst team, we're able to use that to train a model, as opposed to training one that has all kinds of information of unknown validity in it. And then we also have the ability to take that model and reach out directly to our most up-to-date data sources. So the ones that we're out there collecting on the internet every day, we can reach out and quickly bring those updates into our system. And then when we are trying to take the output of this model and shape it correctly, what we're able to do is use our expertise in terms of how we want to solve these problems to be able to shape that model output via human feedback. And then finally, when we get these outputs to the model, we can restrict and validate those. And of course, everyone requires a solid policy around what their employees are uploading to the public web services that are out there. So where do we see these going in the future? So these large, very expensive models, I think, are turning into a lot of smaller models, which have been distilled or shrunken down from the large ones, so that you're able to only train the bits of those models which are actually making a difference in the output, and you can get a very similar results with a lot less money and effort. There's going to be additional hardware support so that these things are going to be able to be rapidly retrained, so they won't be quite so out of date when everyone's trying to use them. But also there's a lot of unpredictability, because the things that are out there in the world are creating a lot of opportunities for people to put their own spins on these things. And I think going forward, we have to be flexible and be able to experiment with that. And then finally, a little bit more of a conceptual thought there is that the language models in particular are helping us realize that language itself, it has a lot more capabilities than people often think it does. So since it can incorporate logical relations in it, by manipulating language, you're able to perform some level of reasoning tasks while also having that natural language interface to be able to communicate with other people. So that's just an extremely rapid overview of something that we could probably spend an entire series of webinars going into more deeply. But now I'd like to hand it over to Allison Wood so she can talk about how these capabilities are impacting her view of the world.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll try to keep this relatively short so that we have plenty of time for questions. But I know that many of you here have probably already been talking to peers or thinking about what generative AI tools mean for practitioners like ourselves in sort of the world of security and intelligence. And opinions on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, I think, range from very optimistic to very pessimistic, not just for the world of risk and intelligence, but for society more generally. And I'm not here to say that one view is more correct than the other, but I do think what's clear is that this technology is here, sort of whether you like it or not, and it's already started to affect the information landscape. So I've kind of tried to think about these things in terms of the positive, maybe in the negative, and how we think these are going to change over time. So I'm a bit of an optimist, so I'll kind of end with optimism. So maybe we can start with sort of the bad and ugly and move on to the good. And I think, the quick research, right, would seem to be an obvious way that intelligence analysts could use these tools, right? It's very tempting to go to ChatGPT and ask for the latest on an event that's happening in the world. And to Matt's points, right, these models are trained on data that's older, so they're not very good at current events. But more so than that, many of you who have experimented with these probably have experienced what Matt referred to earlier as hallucinations, right? ChatGPT and Bard and these tools are very good at sounding convincing, but they can often make things up. And there are plenty of examples out there. You can probably come up with your own. There are even cases of these tools actually making up sources when you ask for those, right? And that's probably a solvable problem and one that these companies are working on, but it is a barrier to using them today, right? But I do think that point around these tools sounding very authoritative, right? They can write very good English, sort of leads into where we're headed in terms of the source landscape more broadly, right? These tools are very good at producing fairly persuasive language. And in fact, academics have already started to do some studies on this. So taking AI generated pieces around policies and matching them up with human generated pieces and seeing how people respond. And in many cases, folks have actually found the AI generated text more convincing than human generated, right? And so this, I think, leads into the concerns that many people have around misinformation and disinformation and the potential for threat actors to use these tools to create much more convincing content. Now, even sort of those malicious actors aside, right, this is going to enable anyone really to create just a lot more content, right? And so it kind of goes back to that idea that the source landscape is rapidly expanding and is going to create just more for intelligence analysts to really sift through, to find the pieces of information that are important and that are essentially true, right? So I do think that we're going to see more complexity around sort of the information landscape more generally. And this lowering of a threshold for producing plausible content, will enable threat actors to engage in new types of potential threats. A couple things that have been pointed to in the realm of cybersecurity are around sort of improved social engineering, maybe generating malicious code, these types of things. But to Matt's point, just as sort of folks like ourselves are experimenting with these tools and seeing how we can use them for good, there will be many other people who are taking these tools and seeing how they can use them for more malicious purposes, right? And so that's kind of why I have this question mark there, is that I think we don't even really fully understand at this point what the ways in which this technology could be used by those threat actors, but it will kind of level the playing field to some extent. And it'll be interesting to see how these tools, sort of the bounds that the companies that produce these tools put on them, the guardrails, and whether there will be sort of open access and in what ways over time. So I'll quickly transition here to some of the good things since I do want to leave time for questions. There's a lot of people who are in the industry who are experimenting with these tools now in really interesting ways. And I think there's a lot of potential for how these tools can be used positively, right? So brainstorming and red teaming, I've already heard of folks using these tools to come up with new ideas of things they should be thinking about in a particular scenario, maybe for building a crisis management exercise or these types of things. Product creation, we all know that, we can create very sophisticated products as analysts, but things like situation reports or maybe travel threat assessments, right? These are pretty templated assessments. And I think over time, these tools could be used to produce those much more efficiently and could be an advantage to folks that maybe don't speak English as a first language, right? To just create sort of more streamlined products. Now, where things get more exciting, I think, was to Matt's points where you can limit sort of the sources that you're using or train these models on more specific types of data that you have a sort of higher level of trust in, right? And so this is where I think we get into things like customizable tools that intelligence analysts could use, maybe even ones that contain your own sort of proprietary data that you might have to enable you to conduct analysis. And I think purpose-built assistance, right? This is something that people are already talking about more broadly in the world of AI, but something that could absolutely apply to analysts more generally. So what does this mean for your average, I think, intelligence analyst or team? There's a couple of points that I think that are worth making here. One is that the focus will really be on analysis going forward, right? If these tools are used correctly, I think there's a lot of potential for them to leave analysts more time to focus on the so what, interpret what it means for their customer or for their business or whoever it might be, rather than spend as much time on research, which is great, but it also sort of might put more pressure on analytical teams to really show that value in the work that they do. Source types and verification is also, I think, going to be very important, right? So as the source landscape expands, as there's more and more sort of generative material out there, it's going to become increasingly important to have some sort of verification of the information that you're using. This is something that we're thinking a lot about at Seerist, and one that sort of we see folks thinking about more broadly in the information sort of world more generally. And I think that means that analysts will increasingly have to have sort of tools and tradecraft skills in order to do this type of research, right? In order to understand sort of or verify information that they find over the course of their research. And I do think there's interesting ways in which sort of the instincts and regulation that we're seeing around privacy interact with sort of generative AI, and how these things could make it more complicated for researchers to really identify whether there's a person or a machine around certain material that's being generated. So that's been a very quick, I guess, traipse through generative AI and some of our thinking on the implications for the sector. Elisa, I will go ahead and hand it back to you so we can get on to some questions.
Fantastic. So a number of you, when you registered, shared some questions. So we're going to dig into that, but also feel free to put questions in the chat if we don't cover something that you're curious about. One thing, Allison, you sort of touched on it briefly. Charlie in the chat had talked about that you can't take generated information for granted, that you have to be doing the fact checking of the sources. And someone else was asking about, and I'm tying this together, is what are the risks of the AI? But then what's the role of humans in authenticating data and incidents? And I think people are just curious in general about what does that human role look like in the future, and how is it going to impact all these capabilities that are coming out?
Yeah, so I think a couple things here. I mean, right now, with sort of all of the concerns that exist around hallucinations, I think it's still important for, if you're going to be using these tools, to have a baseline level of knowledge about the questions that you're asking these tools, and do a bit of fact checking yourself, right? So in that sense, we've had some of our analysts experiment with some of these tools, and you can, because they know something about the questions that they're asking, right, they can kind of immediately determine whether the text that's being produced is right or wrong. It's pretty much believable in terms of the way it's written at all points, right? So you have to have a certain level of expertise with these tools at this point still. But I do think that over time, this will always be kind of an element having a certain level of expertise to sort of catch, right, whether some of these are hallucinations. I think one other thing though that is worth mentioning is that over time, I think as these tools get more complex, and Matt might have something to say about too, right? The way you interact with these is different than using a search engine, right? The way that you sort of pose questions, ask them, and whatnot. And I think that that will be a skill that analysts need to build over time, right? Is how can they engineer prompts to get the most out of the tools that they're using?
Yeah, there's two more aspects I think that are interesting from my perspective. One is uh, observing the user behavior in order to better shape the output, so that we can take the feedback from analysts on whether a particular response is good or not, and use that to help shape future responses, so that we can sort of use the expertise that we have in order to improve the feedback. And essentially that's the value proposition, is that we'll be able to look at more stuff than we have people to look at currently. So this would give us kind of a first draft of things in a wide variety of places, and sort of accelerate that process of turning that into something that's more of a finished product. The second aspect that we're looking at is trying to go back and use a separate process that's a more verifiable sourcing process, so that if you get some generated text, go back and search through that text for the claims or assertions that are made in there, and then try and find sources in our verified knowledge base that back those up, so that you could essentially footnote that text with the relevant pieces of information from our knowledge base. And so that allows us to leverage some of the knowledge that we've accumulated to be able to take that output and connect it to things that we have, at least at that point in time, accepted as facts.
Great. Thank you all for that. And there's some interesting chat going on also in the chat bar. So if people aren't following along, that's kind of interesting. But one of the things that Megan just brought up is, will there be an industry interest in developing more human-centric networks? And I think that's somewhat tangential to the question we got about how is AI going to progress the qualitative elements of risk intelligence, which obviously here at Seerist, we heavily rely on that human aspect and that human analysis that we're getting through control risk. But I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on how that's going to evolve over time as well.
I'll go ahead and start maybe, and then
Okay.
I'll hands to Matt. So I think, you know, to I think to Megan's point, maybe around developing more sort of expert sources or human-centric networks, I think this goes to kind of what Matt was talking about, right? Like if we can find a way to maybe use these models only against certain sources that have been verified by sort of experts, then that could be a really powerful way to use these tools. Or if we can improve the sourcing around these, I think that would help move us in the direction of being able to trust these tools a bit more to gain certain efficiencies, right? So I think that's a space really to watch. In terms of the shift towards more qualitative data that can be used in analysis, I mean, I think that's actually something that's been happening for a while, right? That doesn't trace back exactly to generative AI, but I do think there's the potential for this, and not just generative AI tools, but AI tools in general, right? To help analysts use that type of data in their analysis, right? And this goes back to things like assessing sentiment around sources that you're seeing in the world, or detecting anomalies and levels of data that you're seeing come from a certain geographic area or maybe around a certain issue, right? And I think that those tools will continue to be part of an analyst toolkit, right? And we'll continue to see those evolve over time in a probably much faster way than we have over the past couple of years. Matt, you probably have some other thoughts on the quantitative side as well.
But definitely on the qualitative aspect that you mentioned, I think you're absolutely right that it's not necessarily a generative task, but it's a discriminative task, in the sense that, for example, we have 10 levels of severity that we assign to events, and we're able to build a model that's able to make some of those qualitative assessments based on either a training set of information that's come in that maps things to those categories, or from some heuristic in terms of the factors that can be extracted from the information that match up with that. I think interestingly on the generative side of things, though, is that you can use generative models to generate, to kind of build those classification tasks as well. So to the extent that the output is fairly flexible, you can have the output be a highly severe event or a low severity event be the thing that's actually generated by a generative model. So that's another area where we're actively experimenting and seeing pretty good results.
Great. Matt, a question just came in the chat too around what is the process for taking a chat GPT like public model to relearn using a limited curated set of sources, or does the model have to be totally regenerated?
There's two approaches to that. One is to start from scratch and using your own data set, pull together information and train a model from scratch. That it's difficult to have enough information to do that. Just simply in comparison to the volume of information that's on the internet, any particular enterprise holdings are typically not large enough to have a sufficient data set size to be able to train a large model meaningfully. So what has been done, and I referenced this briefly earlier, is to be able to extract from that model a subset of it that can be trained, so that essentially you're using the baseline training set as a way to more or less teach the model what language is, and then you're fine-tuning it so that all the responses that it has are related only to the data that you've used on that fine-tuning stage. And it's not perfect, but it does allow you to sort of have the predominant responses from the model be driven by data sources that you've provided. And then the secondary way that we've been able to do that is to have what the model generates actually be queries into our own holdings. So as opposed to trying to actually train the model as the end-to-end answer to the question, being able to use that model as an interim step to be able to generate something that's going to actually query to our live data sources.
Great. I know we just have a minute or two left, so I'm going to throw one at you, and then if you can stay on, maybe we can answer a couple of others. But someone asked when they registered, is AI going to be able to accurately predict future events? And what's your sense on that? Obviously, I know we say at Seerist, we're starting the process of being able to forecast potential disruptions. What's your sense on where that's going to go?
I think that, there's a lot of different things that people might mean by that. I don't think there's anything there to suggest that it's going to be better than people at predicting the future at this point. What it can do is take the kinds of factors that people are using to do future predictions and do those at a much greater scale. So that if you have a methodology that you're using to make future predictions, so for example, the weather, we have a pretty long experience in terms of putting models together that can provide a certain level of accuracy out for a particular time horizon, but the further out you go, you're predicting more kind of climactic type things rather than weather related type things. So I think it's, there's no magic there where it's going to be able to put all this information together and give us some kind of future prediction that goes beyond our current way of doing that. And I think, the other factor that comes into this is even in some limited domains. So for example, predicting the stock market is one thing that people always want to do, as it's a way of making money, right? So the challenge is if everyone is using these tools to decide which stock to buy or sell, that in itself affects the market, right? So to some degrees, it's helpful if you have a slight prediction advantage or a timing advantage, so you can make moves before other people. But the presence of these things is going to affect what the future is. So I'm not sure that predicting the future is and if you take actions that actually then affect that prediction, I'm not sure that it's going to do what everyone thinks it's. I'm not sure that predicting the future is actually possible in the way that some people are thinking of it.
Got it. Great. We'll just go to one more question for anybody that can stay on, and then we'll, and for anybody else to jump, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Obviously, reach out if you have other questions that we didn't answer today. But one last question, Ian, from Ian for Matt. Do you think there'll be a Moore's Law, which I personally don't know what that is, for the lack of a better term, for generative AI, or is it limited to human interaction design support? So I don't know if that means something to
well,
you.
I think what that's referring to is sort of a doubling in CPU, the number of transistors that would be on a CPU every 18 months or so, which was happening for quite a while from Gordon Moore at Intel. We are seeing a similar growth in, let's say, the number of parameters that are in a model. So the model size parameters that, what was big, it was the BERT model from Google in 2018 at, and now the most recent models that are coming out are, let's say on the order of 25, to 50 times that. I'm sure we're going to see trillion parameter models pretty soon. At some level, what limits these things is the quantity of training data, right? So if you're only putting so much training data into these models, there's only so many parameters that you can accurately tune. So I think we're going to have to, in addition to model size, we're going to have to think about training set size. Now, one of the things that you can do with the generative model, of course, is generate more training data. So maybe these problems solve themselves. But what we haven't seen yet is a sort of a drop-off point or a plateau coming from the size of the model, so that as these models have gotten larger and as the training sets have gotten larger, up to this point, that has also corresponded with an improvement in model performance. So there may be a point where that's no longer the case, but I don't think we've gotten there yet. Perhaps we will, and that's one of the things we'll see where it goes. But so far, it does look like model size is continuing to increase along with the performance that comes from that.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Thank you both, Allison, Matt. I really appreciate your time today. I hope this was super beneficial for everyone that joined us. Thank you all so much, and hope you have a great rest of your day and week.